It's Wednesday, November 1st, 2023, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues, Kathy Kiley and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, another U.S. journalist held in a Russian jail. We'll talk about the case of Alsu Krumasheva.
Why did you come here?
I work with my uncle.
Now we're going to talk about a local story. One of the Local One Read books has now been adapted for the silver screen. We're going to talk about Killers of the Flower Moon and the role Native Americans have played in the telling of this Native story. And ESPN doctored a video published on X, formerly known as Twitter. We'll talk about why and whether there needs to be more transparency and maybe even an apology as to how and why it happened. There's a lot more that hopefully we will get to today, but let's start with the executive order President Biden signed Monday afternoon, enacting sweeping regulations on the development and use of artificial intelligence. He invoked the Defense Production Act to make this happen. It's the same 1950s era law that was used a few years back to push the development of vaccines and COVID testing that can be done at home. Why would it be applied here in this situation too?
Well, I mean, I think the reason it's applied here is because it's moving so fast. Same thing with COVID. I mean, COVID was moving fast. We needed to sort of speed up production as it related to the vaccines and those sorts of things. This is going to be different because, I mean, with AI, it's not a emergency, but he's sort of using it in that context because it's changing so fast. The laws need to sort of figure out a way to keep up with it. I mean, even the European Union, who was way out in front in trying to deal with artificial intelligence, found itself behind, even though it thought it was ahead. And so I think that's one of the reasons why he's invoking that to sort of deal with this, because every time it looks like we sort of have a grasp of what's happening with AI, they come out with something else, and it's just moving very quickly.
I think this is in part political, too, because when you invoke the Defense Production Act, it's basically signaling this is a really big deal. And but really, I think the speed that Biden wants, the Defense Production Act traditionally has been to send a message to producers to produce faster. Here, I think it's really saying to regulators, regulate faster. Congress, one of the things he did was, when he made the announcement, was call on Congress to pass some legislation, and I think also signaling that the regulators in the executive branch to start to be a little more aggressive. I mean, the U.S. is far behind Europe and other countries in terms of regulating big tech, and I think this is in part a response to that.
I mean, I think this is where you might get some bipartisan support.
Yes.
Which you haven't seen on almost any other issue. This might be the one, because I think both the right and the left see some sort of need for regulation as it relates to...
Yeah, for very different reasons.
For very different reasons. But this is where they might come together to say, hey, okay, there needs to be something done in this area.
No, absolutely. And it's going to be a real debate. I mean, I just came out of a class and I was telling the students that this is really going to be the public policy debate of their generation. How do you regulate big tech while preserving freedom of speech? And so I think part of it is going to be regulation, and it's going to have to be carefully calibrated. But I also think part of it, and that's where political events like this can have an impact, is raising the consciousness of the population to just what the power of this big tech is and what are we giving up when we give our data? What should we be watching out for when we consume this information? Is it AI? Is it not AI? So I think this is going to be a process of both public education and regulation.
Isn't that one of those things, though, that we've been a battle we've been fighting for the better part of a decade, since maybe even 15 years, since smartphones became as prolific as they are? That idea that every time you're using the GPS, you're transmitting data back to Google or to whomever about your location, about your habits, about, different apps where you become the product because you are giving up access to your microphone, to your contacts, to all of these different things. So how do we approach that education differently today than we have been, or heighten people's awareness, or explain to them why this matters to them, or why they should start thinking about it now, if we've been fighting that battle somewhat unsuccessfully for as long as we have?
Well, I just think we need to double down. And I do think it's healthy that there's some bipartisan consensus developing around this. You and I, Amy, have been involved in media literacy efforts, and you are seeing in state legislatures across the country increasing awareness. Illinois, right next door, has a media literacy requirement that's used in their public schools. And so I think people know that their data is being harvested instinctually. What I think they're not fully aware of is how that data is being turned back on them to really manipulate opinions and potentially alter behavior. And I think that's where we really have to educate people as to how that data is being used for, in some cases, commercial purposes, but in other cases, propaganda.
And I do think that people have picked up on the fact that it is the algorithms are being used to sort of force feed them in terms of their buying habits, what they're likely to buy, those types of things. I think from the political standpoint, there's still this sort of disbelief that it somehow has a way in which to influence what they do in the political spectrum. And I think they haven't quite caught on to that yet.
No, I think that's the big difference. They understand that their advertising is targeted. Yeah. What they don't understand is that the news is targeted to them as well. And that is a hard concept, because if I think all of us tend to look at the media as the media, and we tend to read social media as though it were the newspaper. It's very different, and it can be targeted at you, and it is being targeted.
It is, yeah.
And so it affects your worldview.
So how might this executive order affect journalists, affect how news organizations or corporations may experiment with AI or use it in some ways to feed? I mean, there's a white paper you can read on our links blog from the News Alliance. It's also saying lots of chatbots are being fed and populated using local news coverage. So how does this kind of affect our sphere?
Well, for one thing, I think from the consumer point of view, it's going to require AI platforms to disclose their safety tests. And I think that is a direct result of what we found out about Facebook. With the leaks of the Facebook papers, we know how much Facebook knew about how its app was starting to, a kid would look for health food and suddenly is reading why anorexia is great.
Right.
So that kind of thing, being required to disclose what you know is one thing. And then the other thing where I think AI could be helpful, especially for strapped newsrooms, is being able to create ways to scrape local city council agendas. There's a big experiment at Stanford for doing that. There are ways it can be used, but I think the users have to be building their large language models themselves, because you want to make sure that what's going in there is high quality, vetted information, and not just anything that you suck up on the internet, which we know is not high quality.
I think the other aspect of that with the white paper that's on our links blog is how do you monetize that? Because I think what's happening right now is I think what news organizations are trying to do is get ahead of this, unlike what they did when Google came out and Facebook and others, where they were just basically taking the content of the news providers and putting it up there. Now they're saying, wait a minute, we want to be on the front end of this. If you're going to use our content, you're going to pay us for it. And so I think that's where we are right now.
Okay. Last week, jailed Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich marked his 32nd birthday, still held in a Russian jail. And this week, another U.S. journalist learned that her detention would continue for at least another month. She works for Radio Free Europe, based in Prague, and holds both Russian and U.S. passports. She went home to Russia in late May to attend to some family business and was taken into custody when she tried to leave June 2nd. Now, Kathy, Alsu Kumasheva is accused of not registering as a foreign agent. It's a new law in Russia that was passed last year following the invasion of Ukraine, but her case isn't getting the same amount of attention that Evan seems to be.
Well, I think part of that is the outlet she works for. I think the Wall Street Journal has, as we've said on the show, done yeoman's work in keeping Evan's name out there. Radio Free Europe is a government operation, and it is a little more. I think probably they are not being as aggressive because they may be negotiating behind the scenes. But I certainly think this case deserves as much attention as Evan Gershkovich's, and it's part of the same pattern. I will say one thing about this case. The charge that's been levied against her about not registering as a foreign agent, under the Trump administration, the U.S. government required Al Jazeera and Central China Television, China Global TV as it's rebranded, and a couple of other organizations, RT, to register as foreign agents. And the problem with that is that, and people said it at the time, it's going to set up retaliatory moves. And I think here's Exhibit A. We in this country should be strong enough as a democracy that we can help police our own space without having the heavy hand of the government coming in and saying, you must register. I'm very uncomfortable with the government asking journalists to register for anything. And I think this is, unfortunately, what the Russians can say is, well, you make RT do it, so we're going to make your correspondents do it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's one of those situations where when we had the administration, the presidential administration, that politicized journalism to what it thought was its benefit, it opened the door for those same kind of actions to happen overseas, and the Russians were the first to take advantage of it. But I would not be surprised if it didn't happen someplace else. I mean, we're not in that situation now because we have the Biden administration, but you could easily see it happening again.
Yeah, and the Biden administration has not rescinded that rule.
Right.
So these correspondents who are located here are still required to register as foreign agents. So I think you're absolutely right. The door's wide open for other countries to kind of do a tit-for-tat thing.
I mentioned that Evan's birthday was last week. Any news on his case?
Things aren't moving, and I think we just have to keep talking about it, but we're dealing with Vladimir Putin, and what does he want? What kind of a swap? The assumption seems to be that whatever he wants is not in the United States, or whoever he wants as a prisoner swap is not in the United States purview, that it would have to be another country. And, it's this very awkward situation because if you cave to something like that, does it just invite more kidnappings and hostage taking? It's a brutal situation.
We see that, and we see how we may have paved the way for it. Kathy, this next story that we're going to talk about, you've been pretty involved with as well, writing an op-ed that appeared in the USA Today. It was about some comments Nebraska Governor Jim Pilcher made in response to a story written by one of our alumni, Yangshi Zhu. She was reporting on nitrate levels in water and a connection to childhood cancers. And her story mentioned that the governor's family's hog farms is being among those that have been responsible for the contamination. A radio reporter asked Pilcher for his reaction to the story. Let's listen to what he said.
Well, number one, I didn't read it and I won't. And number two, all you got to do is look at the author. Authors from Communist China. What more do you need to know?
Found it pretty disheartening. That was the only thing he said. I had really hoped that the governor would respond to us and that could really help the story and tell the full story in a way, but I was not expecting him to only address one thing. That's where I'm from.
So that was Yang Shizhu who was talking there about what has happened and her response to his statements. Now, Kathy, your op-ed that's in the USA Today, people can read it on our links blog. In there, you did not mince words.
No, I think it's really important. I think that what the governor did was a classic example of changing the subject, but he changed the subject by smearing the messenger. And that smear was completely out of line. Yang Shi is a terrific journalist. Since leaving here, she's worked for a number of top flight organizations. Her editor wrote as tough a column as I did in her defense, and he too is a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism, so I'm really proud of both of them. But I think it's really important to point out, again, as Ernest said, this is politicizing journalism. And, in the America where I grew up, you don't get judged by an accident of birth, something that you have no control over. You get judged by your work and your merit. And Yang Shi did a very well-reported, fact-based story, and the governor did not address any of her reporting or any of the facts. He just cast an aspersion on her based on something she has no control over. I thought it was outrageous, and I think it's something we just need to call out, because this whole smear the messenger tactic is, it's really a tactic of dictators. And we don't want to see that happening in our country.
Well, I think that's sort of where we are right now in terms of our politics, at least on one particular side of the aisle, where if you don't have a coherent message in response to the information that's out there, you attack the journalists who put that information out there, whether they got it from a credible source or from any source, as long as you don't agree with it. And to me, it's one of those things where I think that the reporter, for whoever asked the question, should have came right back at the governor and said, "Hey, but what about the story? What about the information?" And that's where I think, and instead she became the story, and where she was from became the story, and we still don't have any information from the governor or anyone in his family about what the story was, which is these chemicals are winding up in the water,
giving
in
cancer
the state
to children,
of Nebraska, and leading to cancer in children. That's the answer where we want to get.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Have you had any contact with Yang Shi in the past couple of weeks?
I have. I did, and she seems to be doing fine. I did put her in touch with Pan America, which is a great organization that has a digital security. They do a handbook on that. And I will say that I was really heartened that most of the responses I received to the column were positive in terms of, we can't believe that a U.S. official is talking this way about a journalist. So I was really happy to see that, because usually, as you know, we get brickbats, but people really reacted strongly to it. So I think that's a good thing.
Okay. In 2018, David Grant's Killers of the Flower Moon was Daniel Boone Regional Library's one read, read and studied by mid-Missourians. And last Friday, Martin Scorsese's adaptation opened in theaters nationwide. The film is said to follow the book pretty closely, putting a spotlight on the murder of dozens of Osage following the discovery of oil on tribal land. It stars Leonardo DiCaprio as Ernest Burkhart, who moves to Fairfax, Oklahoma, to work for his greedy uncle, the character's name William Hale, played by Robert De Niro. We see Burkhart marry Molly, a wealthy member of the Osage Nation, and shortly after, members of her family die in horrible, gruesome ways. And then soon after that, the story of greed and racism grows and becomes clearer and clearer. This is another story of the early 20th century and racial crimes that went largely untaught and unknown among the American people, much like the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Yeah, and this is another instance in which you had it all boiled down to money, really, and money and power, and the ability of certain individuals, in particular, the white men of that region, who basically said, "Look, we found oil here, and we want it, and we're going to take steps to make that happen." That sort of keep us out of the limelight, but also gets us what we want. The fascinating thing about this, I have not seen the movie yet, but I have read the book. I'm glad that it stuck to that. But in reading all the stories about it, which are on our links blog, the Osage Nation was really grateful that the movie producers and the writers came to them first and said, "Hey, we want to work with you all to make sure that we are as authentic as we can about what this really was."
And that's the part that I really want for us to talk about. That idea too, because it's also said that that Grant, in writing the book, also very much involved the Osage in his research and in his writing of that book, and just how important that was. There's something like 44 members of, or I don't want to say that they're all Osage, but 44 indigenous actors credited in the movie.
And several people working behind the scenes.
I was going to say, and many, many more who were working in off-camera roles as well. And that's really important. That idea of not only telling stories about people or about history, but with people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it was definitely important for them to do that, and I think it gives the film legitimacy that you don't often see, or you haven't seen in other films that are basically telling someone else's story, but not from their lived experience. And that was something that they really worked hard to do here.
One of the other things that I'm reading about this movie, because I too have not seen it yet, it is said that it's likely to be Scorsese's final film. It's just shy of 4 hours, and that there's questions about whether people would be willing to sit in a theater for 4 hours or sit for a 4-hour movie, and if it would have been better as a mini-series, as something that could have been broken up into 1-hour chunks instead of having people sit and watch it for 4 hours at a time.
Well, I worked at the newspaper that was famous for short stories, USA Today, and so I do think that I think making this, especially a movie of this importance, more accessible is probably not a bad idea. And maybe at some point it will be broken up and made so more people, because 4 hours is a big commitment, let's face it. And I think there are people who are willing to do that, but not everybody can do that. And it's an important story to be told. So I think...
Yeah, I mean,
chapters
going with
would
that
be good.
and comparing it in some ways to Schindler's List, which was also very long.
Yes.
And for some people, it was very hard to process sitting in the theater in one sitting. That perhaps, especially for as a story as important as this one, that many, many people going to see it may be going for De Niro and DiCaprio and Scorsese, and then being presented with this very heavy, very important historical story, this heavy moment they may not know about, that having more time to process.
Well, this is Apple's Apple Plus's. This is their foray into these full-length features that they're going to show in the theaters first. And I think it was like 45 days after the opening, it goes to to Apple Plus. It goes to Apple Plus, and at that point, then people will have the ability to be able to start, stop, that sort of thing. And they've got 2 more coming. I think Napoleon's coming out over Christmas. So
I could see this as being kind of the video version of a reading group, where
absolutely,
you watch part of it, talk about it, then watch the second part and talk more about it. So to your point, Amy, you can process this because it's pretty heavy.
Yeah. Okay.
One of the links on our blog this week suggests that sometimes a company just needs to take the L and move on. feel like I say that to students a lot too. You mess up, accept it, take responsibility, and move on. Not ESPN's social media team, at least not this week. ESPN's Sports Center account on X, formerly known as Twitter, shared a video which appears to show Milwaukee Bucks point guard Damian Lillard in an on-court interview with the network. The only problem? It wasn't authentic to the moment. It was digitally altered, a version of an interview that Lillard gave 3 years ago while in the NBA bubble while he was still playing with the Portland Trail Blazers. ESPN went as far as to digitally replace the TNT logo and change the logo on his jersey and on the floor. You know, Ernest, I have to tell you, as I was writing this, I could just kind of envision you shaking your head and being like, what were they even thinking what they did this and why they did this? And to make it worse, ESPN offered one of those like non-apologies that they didn't mean to misrepresent anything. Well, what were you meaning to do?
Well, that's what I kept saying. What were you meaning to do? I mean, what was the point? Why did you do that? I mean, it was after his first game playing for the Milwaukee Bucks, after basically coming over as a free agent from Portland. And Damian Lillard gave countless number of interviews before and after that you could have used. You went and pulled something from the bubble, right? Which most NBA fans would love for you to just forget.
Ever happened.
Right, it ever happened. And you did all this doctoring, you put it up, and didn't say anything. It's the lack of. I mean, tell us why you did it and why you weren't transparent about it. That's the issue.
So here's the other part of it too, right? We're talking about ESPN, which is owned by Disney, which is like the world's biggest protector of copyright ever, right? Why would they do this and take someone else's?
Yeah, well, the thing that struck me was so much effort went into, there was
you had to
so
work
much
at that, didn't
photoshopping. I mean, this was not an easy thing to do. So you could have just taken all that energy and gone and done an interview. And so it was completely puzzling. But to your point, when you make a mistake that is that egregious, when you do something that is that dumb, you immediately apologize and walk away. But because we're still talking about it because they haven't apologized.
But look at it from this standpoint. We opened up the show talking about the Biden administration
and AI.
And then we have to close the show talking about here's what happens when you don't have some sort of. I mean, I'm not saying we need to have full regulation of things, but come on, it's like you could have at least said, "Hey, we doctored this up because we were trying to do something fun."
Yes,
maybe that's the reason. I have no idea.
I love when a show comes full circle, and I didn't even mean to do it. Before we go, as journalism educators, I want to take a minute to recognize scholastic journalism at all levels and give a shout out to the intrepid staff of the Tyrone Thompson Elementary School in Southwest Las Vegas, where the staff has successfully published its second edition. That staff, they're 4th and 5th graders. We've got some slides up to show people who are watching our show parts of their first edition. It included a poll about students' favorite subject. Spoiler alert, it's PE. And I have to tell you, this is just too much. I am so excited and proud of these kids. It's a school newspaper club, and they've set up a really authentic process with pitch meetings and who's going to write and interview and edit.
Future Tigers.
Yes.
Come on.
Yes. We've got a program for you. Let's talk. Don't wait the next 14 years. That music means we're out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. Read more about what we talked about on our links blog under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also available wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. Like us on Facebook, follow us on X. Our handle there is Views on KBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to the program again, leave comments, questions, see what we'll be talking about next week. Thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing the show, to Kia Thomas for handling the audio, Tim Pilcher composed our theme music, and Nate Brown is our social media manager. I'm Amy Simons. See you next week.